Thank you to everyone and Andrea for inviting me, and it's so nice to meet everyone in person. I've been a fan of all of your work. I am here to really provide a slightly different perspective to many of the things that we were talking about yesterday: state formation, environmental history, resource control, from Cyprus, which is peculiar in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking through are some of the approaches that I've been taking to trying to understand how some of these come together, particularly the rise of states, historical kingdoms, roughly between the 9th and 7th centuries. So hopefully this will be in dialogue with many of the conversations that we were having yesterday, but from a slightly more peculiar lens. So if you are aware of Cyprus, you probably think of copper as one of the main commodities to come off of the island. So in purple here are the pillow lavas surrounding this main mountain massif called the Troodos, and this is where the ore is. And Cyprus, since the 4th millennium, was a major exporter of copper. This is typically how most archaeologists try to reconstruct the political economy of the island. We also obviously know of Cypriot copper and many bronze objects during the early Iron Age and into the Iron Age across the Mediterranean. What I wanted to talk about today instead are trees, and to think more, to situate copper in a broader social field, an economic field. So how did copper intermingle with things like wood resources and water and environmental history in a period where we're starting to see the emergence of cities? I'm going to put that in air quotes because the resolution on what we call cities for this period is really poor. Many of them have only been excavated in terms of their monumental cores. We know very little about demography, and many of the sites have not been fully published or excavated. But I'm interested in political economies and control over things like wood and water resources. So one of the other interesting things about Cyprus is that we lack many textual sources from the island. So I'm going to walk you through a couple sources that got me started interested in wood as a resource, but these come from off the island. So the first mention of the historical kingdoms of Cyprus comes from the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So early 7th century. This is the king Esarhaddon bragging about his new palace at Nineveh. And who are the people bringing resources to Nineveh to build the palace? Kings whom he names from Cyprus. And they're bringing, oops, I was trying to do the pointer. They're bringing things like cedar, cypress, long planks of trees, as well as stones. So the first real instantiation of something, we probably think that the Neo-Assyrians didn't control Cyprus, but had some form of suzerainty with vassal kings there. Very few records that attest to this. Theophrastus has an interesting quote about Cypriot kings who used to not cut the trees, both because they took great care of them and husbanded them, and also because the transport of the timber was difficult. And this comes in a section of his book on plants where he's talking about timber as a commodity. So we get this interesting angle of kings who are in charge of caring for something like forest resources. Much later, of course, but compelling is Strabo, so he's writing this geography in the 1st century. This is a really widely cited source because it's one of the only ones that actually describes the island in all of Greco-Roman literature, but I find it really interesting. So in productiveness, the island is inferior to none of the islands. This is a very imperial projection of a province, right? Cyprus had just become a Roman province, so we get the triad of wine, oil, and grain. And then there's this long section on trees. So what he says, and he's quoting Eratosthenes here, is that at some earlier point, the plains were thickly overgrown with woody vegetation so that they were covered with woods and not cultivated. The mines, so when they started mining, helped a little against this, but because they could thus not prevail, basically over the growth of the forest, the trees were growing so out of control, the kings permitted anyone who wished or was able to cut down the timber to keep the cleared land as his own property, exempt from taxes. So none of these are emic sources, of course. These are all outside sources. None of the genres from which they come are about Cypriot kingship. But I wanted to just make 2 points. One is that copper is not really discussed. Copper is not the export that at least some other polities of the Mediterranean are focusing on. And 2, there seems to be this image of control over forests and timbers. This is one of the starting points that got me thinking about how do we understand wood as a resource, particularly in a period of environmental and social change. So great transformations happening across the island, beginning roughly in the 9th century. One of the issues, and I was talking to some people about this yesterday, so this is the Troodos mountainous area again, not really well surveyed. So we don't really have a good handle on the archaeology of the mountains. And this is my colleague Jurgia Andrei, who did a really wonderful job in a recent article showing that all of us have different understandings of what the forests are. In our publications, we all have different parameters for where the forests begin, where they end, what elevation counts in our settlement patterns. And yet we really don't understand the exploitation of the mountains or the inhabitation of the mountains at any kind of close resolution. Yet, in predominant normative understandings of Cypriot kingships that emerged during the 9th and 8th centuries, it is always copper that dominates the discussion. These are really good-centered models of political economy. Everything is driven by copper. It's the prime mechanism of social complexity. So in reconstructions of how states are forming, it's really this kind of simple formula. Whoever has access to the pillow lavas mines the copper, brings it down to the coast, and exports it off the island. And this has really been the normative traditional way of understanding state formation. So, and here you can see, this is David Rupp's reconstruction of hypothetical boundaries. But the kind of tripartite formula is always there. Mountains with copper, some sort of dependent hinterland, and a coastal harbor. And what emerges in the Iron Age are these cities, typically on coasts. And in my work, I've tried to bring more anthropological approaches to political ecology into this. So what is happening with a state like Amathus? So I work in the South Central area. What is happening with a state like Amathus and its actual relationship to the resources around it, to the coast, and to these smaller scale settlement systems within its, quote, territory? There are a lot of assumptions that are made that we don't really yet have the archaeological resolution to back up. What I wanted to do really briefly is introduce you all to Cypriot city-states because they are weird and peculiar, and I think they lend themselves to some of the things we were discussing yesterday. Talk a little bit about how I've been thinking about environmental history as a way to maybe make a more robust argument for something like state formation, and then some of the approaches that have been helpful for me in thinking about particularly diachronic social and environmental change. So what we have following the late Bronze Age collapse, which is roughly dated to 1200 BCE, is a period, roughly the 11th and 10th centuries, where we have no settlement evidence. I mean, it's a real absolute gap in the archaeological record. I could talk about that later. It's probably real. I mean, we're really not seeing settlement evidence. Things start to pick up in what's called the Cypro-geometric theory period, which is roughly the 9th century. And towards the end of that period, you start to see settlements pop up again, and then a real explosion, so probably demographic growth in the 8th and 7th centuries, so the Archaic period. What we also see emerging right in this 9th century window are signs of permanent storage again. So large scale pithoi for olive oil processing start to emerge again in the archaeological record, harbor activity, and monumental buildings. So these are the major regional polities. I showed you that map earlier. They're mostly coastal. What we have excavated from a few of these, as you can see, large-scale buildings. Many of them include things like storerooms, craft workshops. These are called urban centers, but as I mentioned, we really don't have a handle on how large it was. They start to have city walls by roughly the 7th century. And they also have monumental temple buildings. people assume that they had these dependent chori, so dependent arable hinterlands. We lack any real evidence of fortified territorial boundaries between the city-states. From some of the remaining textual evidence that we have from the island, we think that there might have been the existence, by the 5th century at least, of administrative districts within a particular regional city-state. I'm calling them city-states. Many people on the island call them city kingdoms, which is a term that I find kind of vacuous. It's just a way to say that these are city-states that have kings. So they are monarchical. We think these are probably hereditary autocracies derived from prominent households of the early Iron Age, so in that 11th, 10th century window. Texts started appearing on the island in the 7th, 6th century that attest to kings. So either in the Cypriot syllabary, the Pasileos or the Basileos, the Wanax, or in Phoenician, the milk. And definitely by the 6th and 5th centuries, we have a lot of sort of numismatic, aesthetic attestations to something like aristocratic elites and kingship, so dynasties, so royal households and their various family members. Also, from some of the fragmentary texts that we have, there are maybe some regional particularities between kingdoms, but this is still really, we don't have a lot of evidence to understand exactly how something like the kingdom of Paphos is politically different from the kingdom of Amathus. By the 5th century, in a couple very intriguing inscriptions, we do start to see potentially a language of republicanism, so the king and the city acting together. So the king and the city grant something to a private citizen. What also makes Cyprus unique, so someone mentioned citizenship yesterday. Are these even citizens? Are they royal subjects? We have a lot of evidence of multilingual populations stretching back also into the 11th and 10th centuries. So we have a Cypriot language that is still undeciphered. We have Greek and we have Phoenician, so Semitic languages, all operating at the same time. We also have different scripts. So there's a local Cypriot syllabary, there's also Greek, and there's also Phoenician and Semitic languages. So all of this happening together in many of the city-states. I'm not going to touch the issue of ethnicity here because that's obviously really hard. Some city-states lean more towards like a Greek infrastructure, others lean more towards a Phoenician infrastructure, so using Phoenician as the main language of administration. Scattered evidence would suggest that these are patrilineal, androcentric, and as I mentioned, the political economy is, most people focus on obviously metallurgy and mining, but we also know about agriculture, quarrying, logging, and shipbuilding, which I'm going to be focusing on, and then things like textile production. And here I'm just showing you some of the examples of either bilingual or interesting inscriptions. Okay, so that's Cyprus. And in a way, it offers an interesting counterpoint to some of the things we were discussing yesterday. We've already talked about the global signature. I'm not going to get into the grand solar minimum. I show it here because we really lack paleoenvironmental records still for Cyprus. So we don't have the resolution of southern Turkey or of the Peloponnese that we were hearing about yesterday, or places like Italy. I did a very small pilot study in my dissertation looking at archaeological charcoal as a proxy for water accessibility. And that did show that the Archaic period is getting wetter. So the 7th century. So, you know, coming out of the grand solar minimum, theoretically and speculatively, it would have been wetter on Cyprus. The other thing, though, that I wanted to stress here about that's slightly different from some of the cases we were looking at yesterday, is that it is very semi-arid on Cyprus. So water is a critical resource. Many of those city kingdoms are in areas that are getting less than 300 millimeters of precipitation a year. So a couple of bad years, okay, you can survive that. If you have a string of a couple of bad years over a decade, that's actually going to be much more impactful. And we can see this in the charcoal record. So you can see that the trees themselves are reacting to water stress in a semi-arid environment. So if the general picture of the Eastern Mediterranean is that things are getting wetter and slightly warmer coming out of the coming out of the 8th century. On Cyprus, that would look like fewer interannual droughts, reliable access to water in streams or springs. So Cyprus lacks any perennial rivers. So in wetter seasons or in wetter years or wetter decades, you're going to have more reliable stream flow. You might also actually have near perennial springs. So we've done, geomorphology in the region that I work in that show that in these wetter periods, there's much more local access to things like fresh water. There also would have been expansion of what's particularly pine and oak woodlands in the Troodos foothills. So at these lower elevations, roughly like between 200 and 400 meters. What I focus on, or in my recent work, is that this is happening at a time of great social transformation, and it's leading to new norms of weather and climate. I think someone was mentioning this, maybe in Andrea's talk, or like new normals of what seasons look like. The other interesting thing, and this is a problematic study that was done on Cyprus, the Kanievsky et al. This is a lake core from the one salt lake, really, on Cyprus, the Larnaca Salt Lake. What I find interesting about this is that it's been used by people like Neil Roberts to connect to systems of complex agriculture in Western Asia. So something like the Vasis here, occupation phase. So basically, this is time transgressive. This is based on palynological studies. But after roughly the late Bronze Age in places like southern Anatolia, southern Turkey, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, we have this period of intensive land use and wood clearing to make way for agriculture. So we're seeing in pollen records from places, just north of Cyprus and to the east in the Levant, evidence of forest clearing or olive production. So you're either clearing land for agriculture or you're investing in things like arboriculture. So this is a complex system of agriculture that's appearing in numerous proxy records. This core from Larnaca Salt Lake, we don't have to get into the details of why it's problematic, but it suggests that something similar could be happening on Cyprus at roughly the same time. So into the Archaic period, we're seeing land clearance, we're seeing forest cutting, woodland clearance to provide timber and arable land for farming, as well as a shift towards polyculture, towards arboriculture, particularly with olive cultivation. Some of the ways that we can try to understand this from the archaeological record on Cyprus is, again, as I mentioned, in this Archaic period, we're seeing the first signs again of massive, or maybe quasi-industrial olive oil production, either from large-scale storage. We also have the emergence of a particular kind of amphora, which starts appearing across the Eastern Mediterranean, the basket-handled amphora, which we know is made locally on Cyprus. We actually have examples that show that it's holding olive oil, and it's appearing on archaic shipwrecks. Also, in one of the very famous royal tombs of Cyprus from Salamis, this is roughly 8th and 7th centuries, everybody talks about like chariots and sacrificed horses, but there are also just a ton of boring olive oil amphorae, which to me suggests that, it's conspicuous production. It's showing that you are able to amass that kind of agropastoral wealth. It's also, and I'm using this here to think about how something like land clearance is making way for olive oil production as well as sources of charcoal. Some of the other ways that I've been thinking about this are in terms of settlement evidence. So my work has focused a lot on survey evidence from a particular area in South Central Cyprus. And one of the patterns that we see are these 8th, 7th century occupations on top of Middle Bronze Age or Late Bronze Age field systems. So they're going back, I don't know where they went, we haven't surveyed the Troodos, so maybe they went up into higher elevations in that really arid phase of the 11th, 10th centuries. They're coming back and they're settling in all different kinds of niches in these river valleys, and they're seeking out places that have the relics of earlier kinds of land use, particularly in the forms of things like cross-channel walls, check dams, terraces. So there's an idea that comes out of political ecology of land desk investment. So this is maintenance of things that can actually project generations into the future. So you are doing things to the landscape that anticipate future land use practices. And they can be sustained over time. And this, for me, has been helpful for thinking about intergenerational land use. So ways that particular groups are reappropriating or taking over existing landscape features, as well as maintaining them for future generations. This is some of the ways that I have been interpreting the survey evidence. We also just, in terms of thinking about resources, as I said again, copper doesn't just like magically come out of the ground, right? You need woods, you need water. It's mixing with lots of other kinds of minerals, soils, acid drainage. So it's in a complex material field, and some of these ways of thinking about how authorities manage and control resources have been helpful. One example of this to come out of the northern Troodos foothills around the city kingdom of Thomissos. There was a study done on terraces that shows that these terraces, probably for something like arboriculture, were created during the Middle Bronze Age. So we have a lot of survey evidence around the terraces, a gap during the Late Bronze Age, and then a return in the 8th century. So they're going back to terraces and they're reusing them, not out of like social memory. They don't like, oh, my ancestors used these terraces, but because they're there and they're still working and they still retain soil. And it's a good way, especially for something like olive oil production, because olives take a long time to start. They need, years, sometimes decades to actually be able to produce enough. So if you're taking over existing terraces, you're getting a kind of jump start on potentially already existing olive fields. One of the other things that we can think about is all the evidence for mining, which, based on radiocarbon dates, does also appear in this 8th, 7th century window. This is a site called Ayavardra Almiras, which is also in that area on the northern Troodos foothills, roughly archaic to early Hellenistic period. And we know from excavations at the site, we have mines, we have roasting pits, we have kilns for smelting. We know that they're also probably growing olives as a source of wood fuel. So in addition to probably using the forest resources for charcoal, they're also managing probably orchards as a supplementary form of wood fuel for something like mining. I'm also listing here, obviously forests would have been used for shipbuilding, foodways. We heard about letting your pigs eat in forests. These are things that I obviously have no archaeological evidence for now, but as a way to think about how forests are being managed and used. The other thing we can look at in terms of the survey evidence are mining communities. So evidence of settlements appearing in the 8th, 7th century around mines. This is the area I work in. In the pink, you're seeing these pillow lavas. This is where the copper is. So these igneous geological formations. And in the brown is the sedimentary zone. So these sites are occupying arable land at higher elevations, so roughly like 200, 220 meters above sea level. And they're on these paleo landslides, so really deep, good arable soil right next to the area where we have ancient mines, and we have radiocarbon dates from the archaic period. So we can start to think about potential communities. In the red star here, I'm showing you a cemetery. So small scale inhabitation, production happening at the interface of the mines and the river valley. We also, intriguingly from this site, have a sherd with incised signs on it in the local syllabary. So they're hard to interpret, but there's been an argument made that this is potentially, it's one sherd, but potentially evidence of connections to the town. So maybe some forms, as an amphora sherd, so some form of inventorying or managing of resources from town to small scale settlement in the countryside. What's interesting about the area I work in and across parts of Cyprus is that many of these settlement systems seem to wane by the early Hellenistic period. So this is that area of the mines I was just showing you. Some of those settlements continue. So there might be an argument that copper is still valuable to the Ptolemaic Empire, which has just annexed Cyprus in the mid-4th century. But we also could start to hypothesize overexploitation of the forests. Dependencies on something like timber are becoming unwieldy for something like copper smelting. And I have also made the argument that Amathus, which is the closest city-state, is growing, and probably a lot of these people are moving within the lower immediate countryside of the city-state. But this area is mostly depleted and doesn't really pick up again until the late Roman period. So just in conclusion, I hope I didn't go too over. A lot of this is speculative because we don't necessarily have either the paleoenvironmental resolution, the chronological resolution, or the archaeological resolution. But there are ways to think about the emergence, particularly of forms of social complexity in the 9th and 8th centuries that don't just take copper as the prime mechanism of historical explanation. So what I have tried to do is think about new stakes or claims to land use happening in this period before the grand solar minimum. So it's not like climate causes this. Prominent households coming out of the 10th and 9th centuries are gaining more status and wealth. There's the creation of a kind of underclass. We have the emergence of more intensified land use by the 8th and 7th centuries, these forest clearing practices, which are co-constituted then by ecological shifts. And then this allows for some to hold property over others and the better land, so that the land that has more access to water or more access to things like forest resources. So these are just some ideas, and I would welcome other interpretations, but I'll stop it there. So thank you.